She gets nothing. That's what my father said. Right there in front of everyone, at my grandfather's funeral. No warning. No explanation. Just cold words. Meant to erase me. But he didn't know that Grandpa had one final move. One that would flip everything upside down. If you've ever been silenced, underestimated, or told you don't belong, hit that subscribe button, because this story will prove just how wrong they were. Now, let me take you back to the moment it all began. They say grief brings families together. But that afternoon, grief didn't unite us. It exposed everything. The Monroe Estate's drawing room was polished to perfection. Mahogany table, velvet curtains, crystal glasses filled to the rim. My father, Gregory Monroe, stood at the head of it all. Perfect posture, tailored navy suit, that familiar smirk he wore like armor. The room fell silent as he raised his glass. To my son Nathan, he began, who will continue the Monroe legacy with pride and vision. The crowd nodded politely. Some smiled. I stayed still. I knew what was coming. And to my daughter Emily, he paused. I looked up. He didn't meet my eyes. Who will receive nothing? Because that's exactly what she deserves. It landed like a slap across the face. I heard someone gasp. My aunt knocked over her wine glass. Even the housekeeper stopped mid-step. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I had already rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my head. I held my breath. Not out of shock but strategy. Because I knew something no one else in that room did. Not even my father. This wasn't his final word. And it certainly wasn't the end of my story. What Gregory Monroe didn't realize was that I hadn't come to mourn a legacy. I had come to take it back. Let me show you how everything unraveled from there. Let me take you back to where it all truly began. My father always said greatness was earned. But in our house it came prepackaged with a Y chromosome and a golf handicap. Nathan was the golden boy. He flunked out of college twice, crashed 2 company cars, and somehow got promoted each time. At 27, he was gifted a corner office, a 6-figure salary, and a company-sponsored yacht party for networking purposes. The invitation read, "Visionary leadership in the next generation." And me? I was the detail girl. The one they called in when numbers didn't add up, or when legal needed a rewrite at midnight. I graduated top of my class from Wharton, interned at 3 Fortune 100s, and joined the family business the day after my mother's funeral because no one else was willing to hold it together. At 29, I led the restructuring of Monroe Aviation's logistics division, cut operational losses by 22% in under 6 months. We landed a $180 million government contract 3 weeks later. The board applauded. My father sent me a fruit basket with a card that said, "You're intense but effective. Try smiling more." I told myself it didn't matter. That number spoke louder than nepotism. That if I just kept proving my worth eventually, he'd see me. But it was never about results. It was about roles. Nathan was born to lead. I was born to support. And every time I stepped forward, they pulled the spotlight back to him. I remember once, after closing a multimillion-dollar deal, my father interrupted my presentation to ask Nathan how his tennis game was going. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just invisible. I was inconvenient. But invisibility has one advantage. People forget you're watching. And I was watching everything. Every spreadsheet. Every handshake. Every crack in the foundation they refused to see. Which is why, when the real test came, not the boardroom, not the numbers, but something much closer to the heart, I was ready. Let me tell you about the only person in that family who truly saw me. The man whose quiet faith changed everything. Let me tell you about my grandfather. It's strange how the person who speaks the least can sometimes see you the most. My grandfather, Edmund Monroe, wasn't a loud man. He didn't interrupt meetings. He didn't hand out praise like candy. But when he spoke, people listened because his words carried weight, the kind that's earned, not inherited. And he listened. He listened when I was 11 and wanted to redesign his flight route maps with colored pins and yarn. He listened when I was 16 and said I wanted to study economics instead of fashion. He listened when I came to him, after another boardroom suggestion that I lead less, smile more, and asked if I was wrong for wanting more. He just smiled, nodded, and said, "You're not wrong, Emily. You're just early. Keep going." When his health started fading, it was me who showed up every morning. Not Nathan. Not my father. Just me. I made his coffee. I read him market reports out loud. I listened to the same story about his first hangar lease at JFK 100 times, and still laughed at the punchline. When the nurses forgot, I combed his hair. When he couldn't remember what day it was, I reminded him gently, never rushing. One morning, when the light was barely coming through the blinds and his voice was thinner than usual, he said, "I may be dying, but I'm not blind. I see what you've done. I see who you are." That was the day he asked me to call someone. Not the family lawyers, God, no. He didn't trust them anymore. He gave me a name I'd never heard before. A private counsel. Said, "He'll know what to do. Just tell him I want my story told right." I didn't fully understand then. I thought maybe it was a final letter, a personal note, something sentimental. I had no idea what that name would come to mean. But he knew. He knew that when he was gone, the wolves would circle. And he knew I'd be alone. So he left a map. Not to protect me from the fire, but to hand me the match. What I didn't know was just how far he was willing to go to set the truth free. Because 2 weeks after we buried him, and my father toasted to erasing me, that match was about to strike. Let me tell you what happened in that room. When the real will was opened, 2 weeks after the funeral, the Monroe estate was full again. Same room, same chandeliers, same cold air humming through the vents like a warning. But this time there was no grieving. This was business. My father sat at the head of the long table, Nathan beside him, leaning back like he already owned the place. I was placed politely at the far end, next to a dusty radiator, half blocked by a ficus plant no one had watered in months. Mr. Raymond Ellis, the lawyer my grandfather had trusted, walked in carrying 2 folders. One slim, one thick, sealed with wax. People barely glanced at the second one, but I never took my eyes off it. My father stood first, always the performer. He raised his glass again. "To Nathan," he said with a self-satisfied smile, "who will lead Monroe Aviation into its next era with honor." Pause. Sip. Then. "And to Emily, who chose emotion over loyalty. I hope you find peace wherever you land." Polite laughter rippled like static. I didn't move. Let them enjoy their illusion. Then Mr. Ellis cleared his throat. He opened the slim folder first. Assets, homes, artwork. The usual. My name wasn't mentioned. I waited. And then he reached for the second envelope. Thick. Gold-stamped. My grandfather's seal. "Per the private directive of the late Edmund Monroe," he said calmly, "the controlling shares of Monroe Aviation, all associated real estate, and full voting authority are to be transferred immediately to Emily Monroe." Silence didn't just fall. It detonated. Nathan choked on his bourbon. Someone gasped. My father blinked once, twice, then nothing. No words. I didn't smile. Not yet. Because this moment wasn't revenge. It was revelation. It wasn't a twist. It was the next move in a game I had studied for years. And in that moment the room didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to me. But I knew that claiming power and holding it were 2 very different battles. And my father, he wasn't going down without a fight. Let me show you what happened when the wolves came for the throne. First there was only silence. My father just stared. Glass frozen midair, lips parted, eyes blinking like he couldn't process what had just happened. Then he exploded. "This is a farce," he shouted, slamming his hand against the table. The crystal trembled. "You manipulated an old man in his final days." He turned to Mr. Ellis, voice rising like thunder behind years of practiced restraint. "This directive is invalid." He was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. Mr. Ellis didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly slid a folder across the table. "Mr. Monroe underwent 3 independent medical evaluations during that period," he said. "All confirmed full cognitive capacity. These changes were not only legal, they were intentional." My father's anger cracked, not from power but from panic. He stood and began pacing, barking out half-formed sentences, grasping at control that was no longer his. "You don't understand what you've done, Emily. You're not ready for this. You'll ruin everything your grandfather built. This isn't some girl boss fantasy. This is real business. I let him rage. I let him burn. Then I stood slow and steady and said the only thing I'd been waiting years to say. I've been ready, Dad. I just stopped waiting for your permission. The room fell quiet again. For the first time in my life, Gregory Monroe looked at me and didn't see a daughter. He saw a rival. And in that look I knew. He realized he'd already lost. But power doesn't walk away quietly. I knew he wouldn't vanish. I knew he'd call in favors, whisper in boardrooms, pull strings in the dark. So the next morning, while the city was still waking, I stepped into Monroe Aviation, not as a guest, not as a backup, but as the new leader. I didn't make an announcement. There were no reporters, no fanfare, just me, a black coat, and a keycard with my name on it. I walked into my grandfather's old office, looked around the room I used to visit as a child, and changed the locks. Because this wasn't a symbolic victory. It was strategic. And I had just taken the first step in rebuilding the empire from the inside out. But taking the throne is only the beginning. Keeping it? That's where the real war begins. Let me show you how I turned power into purpose. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no press release, no seat at some gala honoring women who lead. I just went to work. Every day. Early mornings. Long nights. Private meetings with department heads. Real questions. Real listening. Not just about numbers or targets, but about people. Culture. Burnout. Purpose. I implemented a zero-tolerance policy on fraud and nepotism. Reinstated benefits that had been quietly stripped away. Created mentorship pipelines for women and first-gen professionals. And slowly, the fear that used to sit in the hallways began to fade. For the first time in years, people spoke up without whispering. That was when I realized the empire wasn't mine to rule. It was mine to heal. My father thought power meant control, fear, obedience. But I learned something else. Power, real power, is quiet. It listens. It builds. It protects. It says you belong here, even when the world says you don't. A few weeks later, I found a package on my desk. No return address. No stamp. Just my name, written in familiar, shaky handwriting. Inside, a photo. I was maybe 5 years old, sitting on my father's shoulders at a company picnic, both of us mid-laugh. On the back, 4 words. You always had it. No apology. No signature. Just that. And for the first time, I didn't need anything more. Because I finally understood. The real inheritance wasn't the company. It wasn't the money or the board seat or even the control. It was the belief I had fought to build on my own. The fire no one could extinguish. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I was ready to rewrite what legacy really means. For my daughter. For the woman I became. For every girl who's ever been told to stay in her lane. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, even just a little, consider subscribing to the channel. We have more real powerful stories coming next week that you won't want to miss. And if you've ever been underestimated, you're not alone. You're just early.